Professor Garrett, there he is in the house, ladies and gentlemen. The champ is here.
I don't know if you can tell or not, but I'm strapped, homie.
He's got the belt, the wrist wraps. He's ready to go.
Oh, but don't forget, I got my lifting shoes too,
And the lifting
brother.
shoes.
Oh,
my
yeah,
gosh.
brother.
We're getting into we're getting in depth today with weightlifting equipment. So
Getting serious.
Levi came prepared, which you got to respect. I appreciate that.
That's right.
I'm glad you got the belt. It's a necessary supplementary piece for podcasting. So I'm glad you're protecting your core here as we discuss the uses, the pros and cons, long-term and short-term of using weightlifting equipment.
Just keeping my posture good, making sure I can develop some inner abdominal pressure and be effective for this show.
I love it. Well, before we get too far in, we're going to go ahead and play our listener question and let you guys listen to that. And then we're going to address that and get into the details of weightlifting equipment.
What's up, Move 101 podcast? My name is Jaden Williamson, and I was just curious about the long-term and short-term effects of using tools and equipment such as weightlifting belts and lifting straps that you put around your wrists, and your guys' thoughts on if these are beneficial or if the long-term effects of compensating for a weakness you may have outweigh the benefits. I look forward to hearing your guys' response.
So first off, I want to say thank you to Jaden for the question. And just again, another reminder that if you guys have questions, you can contact us, through email, through social media, but also if you want to leave us a message and be a part of the show, we love that. We like hearing from you guys and love to be able to include you in this process and be able to address questions that come up. So feel free to use those resources and reach out anytime. Equipment 101. If you're using a weightlifting belt, number one, the mechanism behind that, the reason why a belt can be helpful or can work is that it is designed to increase intra-abdominal pressure, right? So the best analogy that I've heard that I really like is imagine a pop can or a soda can, right? If it's empty and you stand on it, it gets crushed right away. But if it's full and sealed, you could stand on a soda can. It's not going anywhere. So that internal pressure pushing out against the side walls of a soda can is exactly what we're going for here with a weightlifting belt, is that it's allowing us to push outwards against a belt. A belt is not supposed to be cinched down to squeeze everything in. It's there to push against. And by pushing outward against the belt, you increase the intra-abdominal pressure, which then obviously that increased stability or stiffness of the trunk.
Rigidity, yeah.
Yeah, rigidity. It reduces. So the technical term is shear force. So if you think of your vertebrae like at an angle, each of those vertebrae have a little bit of shear force, meaning they're going to kind of, if there was no ligamentous or muscular support, they would all kind of slide forward in a domino effect. And that's shear, or kind of that sliding force. And so the more rigidity we have, we actually decrease that likelihood of shear, which, that's a good thing to reduce that. It provides a little bit more stability in the trunk section through that increased intra-abdominal pressure. So that is what a belt is designed to do, is give us something to push against and increase that pressure. And the obvious, thought process there is to help protect against injury. And certainly there are some performance benefits as well. A couple things to note. If you have heart issues or specifically blood pressure issues or inguinal hernia, the Valsalva maneuver, which is that bracing kind of, holding your breath basically and pushing kind of that internal pressure, those are things to avoid. And you'd want to talk to a doctor before you start adding external things like a belt that would further increase that intra-abdominal pressure. So acutely, in a healthy population, there seems to be no issue there with the acute spikes in blood pressure that do happen when you use the Valsalva maneuver. But again, if you have blood pressure issues or if you have inguinal hernias, those are some things to be careful with, especially when you add on additional external equipment like a belt.
Yeah. And on the topic of the belt, I'd like to get into shoes and some of the other stuff as well. But on the topic of a belt, for me, and I would ask this to you, so maybe I'll ask you first, is when do you actually use it? Like, when is it needed, whether it's for general population or someone looking for peak performance? When do you start throwing the belt on and integrate it into the training day?
Yeah, I think, again, there's a little bit of wiggle room there. For me personally, I think this is fairly well supported in what I've read, research wise too, is I would say roughly anything over 90% 1RM And to kind of equate that, maybe if I'm doing a 3-rep set or less, that's generally, if I'm going to wear a belt, that's when it would be. And these are specifically trunk loaded exercises like the squat, like the deadlift.
If you're only going to use it at a 3 RM, or let's even say a 5 RM, not sets of 5, but an actual 5-rep max, is there even a need for this for anyone that's kind of not getting into those heavy numbers? Because if we're talking a 5-rep max, I mean, we're talking 87, maybe even close to 90%, depending on the person's kind of threshold and true 1 RM. Is there a reason to ever wear a belt if you're not pushing rep maxes?
I think this gets to the very kind of root of the question of like, what does this look like long term? And I think I would say, kind of having gone through a period of years, very similar to you, where we were training for numbers and trying to lift more weight and put more weight on the bar. That is where a belt plays more of a role. Is if you're chasing numbers, if you're lifting for the purpose of getting stronger, the belt helps, right? You
Not
can
just but refine that, maybe not just getting stronger, but trying to be as strong as possible. Because I think those are two very different approaches. Not to split hairs, but I just mean like I'm still trying to get stronger, but I'm not trying to get as strong as I can. And it's a small minor difference, but I think it's big in terms of how you actually approach the training day and what things you might be using, the tools, the sets, the reps, the exercises, and all the other stuff.
If your primary goal is weight on the bar, right? If you're chasing PRs,
yes,
right, numbers, that's when I think like basically you're powerlifting with, maybe you're not competing, but that's your stated goal is to put more weight on the bar. Again, that's where I think that individual is where a belt is probably going to matter more. Obviously it does. So performance benefits that we see, like if you look at research, yes, wearing a belt will make you lift more weight. Like it increases 1-rep max. It increases your ability to do a rep max, meaning if you lift the same weight with a belt and without, you should be able to do more reps with the belt on. It increases bar speed. It increases power. There's plenty of research out there supporting the short-term use of wearing a belt for performance. So if performance is your goal, if you are competing or chasing PRs, like if you are kind of pursuing this sport of lifting, I think absolutely that's like use a belt. But when we start thinking about maybe more of the general population training more longer term, and kind of to your question of like, when should you start using a belt? And kind of what you said, like you haven't used a belt for years, nor have I. Like I'm not training to be maximally strong anymore. I'm training to be strong and in shape, but feel good and be able to have longevity. I'm not using a belt anymore. And I've found that I do feel better. So I think one of the things that we're kind of approaching or talking around is this idea that performance and longevity or health perhaps are different constructs, and not, peak performance is generally not healthy. Like you're probably not going to feel great if you're chasing the biggest number you can put on the bar, right? You're going to feel a little bit beat up. You're going to be doing everything you can to increase the weight on the bar, including wearing a belt probably, right? It's like, you mentioned this as we were kind of talking about this previously, is like you see people wearing belts and knee wraps and everything else, not because it looks good, but because it actually does increase performance. And if you can lift more weight using a belt than beltless, that's better for your sport if your sport is the number, right? But that again goes back to the question of what is this doing long term, and is that 5 or 10% extra that you can put on the bar that maybe you couldn't naturally, right, without a belt or reps? What does that do long term? And so again, I don't want to get too far ahead of where you were going with that question, but that's what I'm thinking of as I think through that question of competing versus maybe the general population who's trying to get stronger and trying to add weight to the bar. But that's not the lone pursuit, right? We also want to feel good and maybe have some aesthetics in there too. But
if we know that we can lift more weight with a belt, why wouldn't we lift weight with the belt to continue developing all of the other strength? So what I'm saying, and maybe to try to provide some context to this, if you could lift 100 pounds with a belt, but you can lift 87 pounds without the belt, if I'm training with 87 pounds, I'm not going to get as strong as if I'm training with 100 pounds. So should I cycle my belt in and out, or should I be cycling my belt in terms of its daily use within the training? Meaning, anytime I get to 90% or greater, I'll kick on my belt because I know I'm going to be able to lift more weight and then prepare my body for that resistance. Or do I train never using a belt until I'm ready to get into a competition or a couple weeks before competition to kind of ramp up? I think you know where I'm going with this one, but what are your thoughts on that?
So yeah, I think it's an interesting way to phrase it, or an interesting question, because the thing that I come back with is strong wear, right? You mentioned like I'm stronger wearing a belt, and to me, it's like, okay, well, are you stronger where?
By numbers.
No, but hear me out on this. So stronger meaning, if you're, let's say you were squatting, your knee and hip extensors are stronger, meaning you can push more weight with the legs, right, using a belt than you can without. But the other piece that we have to consider is, well, what about the core strength, right? If you're pushing more weight because the belt is allowing your basically you're not losing as much power transmission to the bar, right? I always like this picture of, imagine, this is maybe a weird analogy, but imagine like a pillow, right, underneath a bar, right? Like if you were to try to push up through a pillow, like there's a lot of force transmission lost because of the softness there, right? And the same thing with like your trunk, your core. Like the tighter and stronger your trunk is, the less there's a leak of power coming out of that midsection, right? The more you're able to translate from the knees and the hips into the bar upwards, right? That's the whole idea, is having this rigid torso that allows force transmission to go into the bar, which is what we're trying to push upwards. And so that's where I say stronger wear. Is the belt actually making you stronger in your trunk, or is it just kind of masking maybe some potential weakness there? So that's where I say the importance of cycling in and out. Yes, you may be overloading your knee and hip extensors by wearing a belt and having more weight on the bar, but are you actually overloading the trunk muscles and getting stronger in the trunk too? Or is it masking weakness or a weak link in the trunk?
Yeah, that's interesting. And I don't have an answer, but what it brings to mind is that by having the belt, can an argument be made that there's just as much muscular activity going on by bracing and pushing against the belt as if it wasn't there? And if you're adding, 20% of weight or 16% weight greater, you have to still contract the trunk.
Yeah.
So not only am I lifting more weight, but I'm putting more stress on my body to have to adapt to that as well.
Yeah.
So it's like,
overload, right?
Is your trunk overload. Exactly. Is your trunk getting stronger by throwing 100 pounds on your back with a belt, or stronger by throwing 80 pounds on your back without a belt? And the argument to me would be, you're getting stronger with the belt. I mean,
and this is where, like, if you look at the research, this is where it's, so again, trying to come back to the actual question being asked here. And thank you again, Jaden, for the question. If you actually look at the research, I would say the research is a little disappointing.
Yeah. Underwhelming. Yeah.
It's underwhelming, right? There should be more research. To the question Jaden asked, there's really no research that I came across at all with long-term study. Short-term effects, like we could summarize it in saying, yes, wearing a belt does allow you to lift more weight. The interesting thing is when you get into some of the research on EMG studies, so looking at actually like the activation of the different trunk muscles, and that's one of the things that is looked at in some of the research is, does this change how the trunk fires? Or to the point you're making is, having more weight on the bar, does that make our trunk stronger, even if there's an external tool being applied? And again, unfortunately, the research isn't, there's some on both sides, right? So the overall net effect is kind of like, well, we're not really sure, but it's kind of probably somewhere in the middle here, where some EMG studies show that the rectus abdominis, well, actually most EMG studies that I've seen show that the rectus abdominis actually contracts to a greater extent with a belt, but the obliques don't. And so basically what I've seen in the research is that the firing pattern or the bracing pattern of the trunk is slightly different with a belt versus not. And I would agree anecdotally. My own personal experience says, yeah, that is true. I brace differently when I have a belt on than if I didn't. And so I think that's something to consider. And again, if we're making the argument that we should cycle belt use in and out, or perhaps even if we're looking at longevity, like for me, I don't cycle it in at all anymore. I just train without a belt. And so I guess maybe that phrases a question for me to ask you, since you said the same thing of not using a belt. Why don't you use a belt anymore?
Well, I think my ultimate goal is to get a skull cap headband with fingerless gloves, wear a singlet with a leather belt, and some high top shoes. That's my dream. But I don't use a belt at this
Quite a
time.
mental picture there.
Yeah. I don't wear a belt just because it's just one more thing to bring to the gym. Like in all honesty, like I don't lift at those loads anymore either. Like if I really want to stress and kind of push myself heavy, I just add volume now.
Yep.
It's not weight, because I feel where my body's at these days, the volume is more important than the weight. The only time I'm really lifting heavy stuff, in all honesty, is when I'm throwing around rocks or logs. Those are my heaviest days, and you can't really train for that stuff. You can have strong hamstrings and glutes and back and those types of things, but it is such a different beast to try to find a good position to lift 2 foot wide, 18-inch tall bucked log. Like it is, you just kind of suffer. Like you can't, it's not so, and I'm not going to throw a belt on for that. So I think that's kind of the biggest reason why I don't, is that anytime I'm applying what I'm doing in the gym, I don't have any tools. Like it's negative tools,
Right.
in fact. So for me, where I'm at in my life, it is not to lift the most amount of weight possible. It's to lift heavy things for repeated bouts with limited options. So because I'm on a hillside at my house where
that's your sport, right? That's what you're training for is real world. And you're not going out wearing a powerlifting belt in the real world. And that's where it's tough, right? It becomes it's a question mark, because there is no long-term research that we've come across saying, hey, this is something you can get acute benefit or short-term benefit from. Well, that part is for sure. Yes, there is short-term benefit. Long-term, it's a question mark. So unfortunately, that's the best answer we can find in research. One of the other notes I did want to throw in, Dr. Stu McGill, who's kind of the foremost researcher on back pain, and he's out of Canada. One of the things he said that I found interesting was, as he looks at some of the more kind of finely tuned or in-depth studies that he's performed, is that he believes that the evidence says belt usage encourages a very slight amount of spinal flexion when used properly, which I found interesting. I'm not sure. I would like to see more of the info that he's using to come to that conclusion. But that's something to be aware of, that, that's obviously not something ideal. We don't want spinal flexion under load. That said, my experience is kind of like, that's an interesting conclusion. I don't know that that's what I've experienced, but we also need to remember, like, okay, that's Stu McGill. He's done the research, and he's the guy. And so that's something to keep in mind. So I again, short-term benefits, yes. Long-term, question mark. Anecdotally is kind of what we're left with. I feel better lifting without a belt, because again, that like what you're doing is, yes, you are getting more overload, and there's a case to be made that could be something to use in your training. If you're trying to get stronger, overload is a good thing. And like the slingshot, right? Like, have you ever used the slingshot for bench press? Like my bench press went up when I used the slingshot, because it allows you to overload better or greater, to a greater degree. What is that long-term effect though? That's kind of where I think the question is using an artificial overload good or bad for your body? And that's where I think there's, anecdotally, I would question whether that's healthy, right? Just from that sense of kind of what I mentioned about like where like strong wear, like, yes, the knee and hip extensors in the case of a squat are getting stronger from that overload, but at what cost, right? Using that additional overload is something I would be careful with long-term.
So, and that kind of makes me throw this out there. For me personally, you should not be wearing gear to avoid an injury or to manage an injury.
Great point.
That's a whole separate thing. Is you should not need those things to avoid the injury. Like you should be focusing, and this is going back to wringing out the towel here, is, for example, like and this will get us into another tool, which are lifting shoes. I have terrible ankle flexibility. I mean, I have literally 0 degrees of dorsiflexion. So what does that mean when I squat? Well, I have a vertical shin when I squat, which means that my hips are further back and my chest is tilted at a greater positive angle anteriorly. So when I'm a hamstring squatter, more or less, like I don't get into my quads much. Now, yes, we use our quads to extend the knee and so on and so forth, but my squat is posterior dominant for sure. But what the shoes allowed me to do, more specifically when I was doing more of the Olympic lifts, was keep a much taller posture so that when you're catching a clean or you're catching a snatch, you can keep a vertical torso to allow the bar to, or to keep the bar from dumping forward. And so this was a great tool for me. But what it did do is it negated my efforts to improve ankle mobility because I was able to kind of shortcut it in that way. Now, do I think that hurt me? I would say no. I don't think that it hurt me. But what it did do is stifled potential work towards ankle mobility, which I think long term would be better. That said, I don't need a crazy amount of ankle dorsiflexion for my activities of daily living. So I think it's a net neutral kind of experience where it was good for me at the time to use the shoes because I was able to increase depth, keep a taller posture, get into my quads a little bit more. And I use them more specifically. Like, I don't mind my back squat being a posterior dominant squat. In fact, I think it helped because I was developing posterior strength. And then when I would do my front squats, I was developing more anterior strength, or at least anterior dominance. And so I don't think it was necessarily a bad thing to use the shoes on the front squats and then just use a regular shoe or flat foot on the back squats. Equally, in defense of the gear is that, oh, well, it's not allowing you to potentially get as strong in some of these areas. But I don't know if that's a viable excuse to not use a belt because you should do the extra work. Like, if you're not doing additional trunk work and you're trying to get the heaviest squat possible, you're missing out on low-hanging fruit there. I mean, it is really low-hanging fruit to do extra trunk work to make yourself strong enough to be able to brace and support the weight. In fact, when I failed on squats, it was not because my legs weren't strong enough. It's because my upper back was weak. I get 2 degrees extra of spinal flexion, and now all of a sudden it moves the 400 pounds moves away from my center of mass by an inch or two. And that's a lot to make up for in your legs. So now instead of 400 pounds, and I forget what I know that we talk about this a little bit with the weight of our head, like our head's 10 pounds, but every degree we add in cervical flexion adds X amount of weight to the fulcrum point. So our head now that's 10 pounds, because it's further away from our center of mass, it's now perceived as being heavier. And that same thing is true with our squat or our lifts. When we're moving away from a nice straight of a line of action as possible, we're adding weight to the bar that doesn't need to be there. So doing the extra posterior, lateral, and anterior work on the trunk is critical. That no belt is going to save you, and not using a belt isn't going to save you either. Just squatting heavier or just squatting without a belt to build that strength, yeah, it'll be there, but you still got to do the extra work too, in addition to not wearing the belt. So I think it really goes both ways, and it's a tool. It's a supplement. Use it when you should and don't when you shouldn't.
Yeah, technique. I mean, it speaks to the importance of technique. I mean, if you're trying to put numbers on the bar, technique is the number one. I would say the number one driver, followed very closely by the supplemental work that you're doing to hit those weak points and bring up all the other, whether it's posterior chain, whether it's upper back, whatever the case may be.
Yeah, and I think by using the tools, it can either negate and it can also enhance recruiting the most amount of musculature possible.
Yep.
So don't wear the belt and then not brace your midsection. Like, that's definitely not what it's for. So in that example, use that as a tool to create more muscular activation. For me, wearing the shoes, when I would front squat, it made me get into my quads more. Well, even though I'm a posterior squatter, I still need my quads to extend the knee.
Yep.
So using the tool in that sense, an argument could be made is that it actually helped develop quad strength because it shot my shins forward and required more of the shin angle and then recovery at the knees, which is via the quads.
So what about lifting straps? So for those who may not be familiar, a lifting strap is typically right around the wrist, and it's a nylon piece of fabric that can be wrapped around a bar for deadlifts, for rows, etc. Do you think there's any merit to the kind of the point being made of like, hey, if you're not strong enough to hold 450 pounds on the bar, maybe if the hands and the forearm strength is the weak link, maybe your trunk, I don't know. There's an imbalance there, right? What's your thought there in terms of
I mean, but then you can use that same argument for all of it, where it's like, if you're not strong enough to squat 800 pounds, you shouldn't wear a suit. Okay, well, yeah, I guess. I mean, you're right. So, but in
that's to me where it speaks to the long term. Like, again, there's a question mark there of what does this affect long term? And to me, if you're cutting corners, if you're not strong enough to actually hold 450 pounds with your forearm and grip strength, that's an issue. Like,
but
obviously
you're
you need to
also
address
missing
that.
out on overloading your lower half to get that stronger too. So
I would
rather my weakest link be the end of my kinetic chain rather than my trunk and my legs, which are more close to the center of mass or to where my power is going to come from.
Yeah,
so
but
it's
the research on grip strength is pretty tightly correlated with longevity and lifespan.
Totally. But if you're deadlifting 400 pounds, like, you're strong enough and your longevity is probably better than someone that can barely push like 10 pounds of pressure on a grip strength thing. You know what I mean? Like, so yes, but we're talking about old people or fatigued people. And yes, grip strength will be an issue, but to expect that the grip is going to be stronger than your legs, man, your legs suck then. I mean, like, you should drop the bar basically, or the bar should slip out because your legs are strong enough and your grip just isn't. Like, it's the end of the kinetic chain. It is the weakest link. Like, it's literally the weakest link. So I hope that my legs are stronger than my grip. I would say that.
That's interesting. I don't know if I agree.
So you would rather have your grip strong enough to hold 300 pounds and maybe your legs not be able to pull it, versus being able to pull 500 pounds and then you losing grip?
I'm saying, like, I'm like, if you think about, again, the question always has to come back to what are we training for? But to me, it's like, if I would rather fail at the legs and trunk with like a deadlift, if we're talking deadlift, than at the grip and forearm. Because again, it's like, what is this applying to? Like, in the real world, you don't ever have the ability to pick something up if you can't hold on to it. Like, what's the point of having the hip extension strength to lift a tree trunk if you can't actually grip it and hold it?
See, but mine's different because you're not using your grip. You're using your arms. You're using your entire body. So that's like I'm not trying to palm a rock to lift it up. I'm wrapping it up. I'm flexing my spine. I'm protracting my shoulders. Like, I'm in the worst position possible. But I mean, and this is a whole different conversation, but I'm still, just because I'm in this kind of protracted and flexed position, it does not mean that I'm not tensing and bringing as much tension to my muscles as possible to where they're still recruited, and I'm protecting my spine. So,
and I guess what I'm saying is something that it's a thought in the back of my head. There's no way I can prove this. I don't have any evidence for this, but I feel like, if you look at the human animal and compare us to, let's say, our primate cousins whose grips are unbelievable because they spend all their time hanging in trees, there's a disconnect there. Again, totally anecdotal. This is terrible evidence, but there's some kind of a disconnect there where if I can't apply the strength from my trunk and hips to the real world, it's useless strength. Yes, I could demonstrate that in a gym setting, but who cares? Like, it also feels like there's got to be some sort of a again, guessing here, but long-term connection there between those weak links that you're not addressing. And I tend to think you're going to be predisposing yourself to injury by overloading things that you can't really support throughout the whole. If we're looking at the kinetic chain, it's an entire chain. Every link needs to be there. If we're missing a link, there's a point of weakness that likely will turn into an injury at some point. One of the interesting negatives that I saw research-wise with using lifting straps was the tendency, or at least in this research study, the tendency was wearing lifting straps caused this was in a deadlift, caused increased kyphosis, or flexion or rounding of the thoracic spine. And I thought that was interesting. And it made me think, they didn't get into the details of that as much, but it made me think of perhaps this connection, again, kind of talking kinetic chain, of the grip strength to the lats, right? If you don't have quite as much activation in the grip, maybe your lats aren't firing quite to the same degree and you're getting too much, kyphosis in the thoracic spine. Again, speaking to this, it's all connected, right? We know it's all connected. So if you have a weak point in the chain, it's going to cause some problems. So just, kind of seconding your point of don't let these tools become crutches or, filling the place of something you really should be addressing in your training of bringing that weak point up.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, you're throwing this Band-Aid on it. Don't let that be what's happening. One of the things I like straps for is focused back work, right? If I'm really trying to target the lats or traps or, specifically most of the time it's the lats and rhomboids. If I'm doing rows or, high pull down, I don't want my grip strength to be the limiting factor. And yes, you can make the argument that it shouldn't be and blah, blah, blah. But for the example of, let's say we're trying to develop a thicker back or kind of a more bodybuilding approach. If I'm specifically trying to target the back muscles, I don't want my forearm strength to be, I don't want to feel this in my forearm. I want more of a mind muscle connection in the back. And by removing some of that forearm mind muscle connection, right, with straps, I think you can get a better mind muscle connection, a better pump, a better result using straps for focused back work. So that's one of the things I would say, one of the prime benefits that I've used straps for is for focused back work. And one of the things I think they are actually really good for. Well, Jaden, to wrap this up, we again want to say thanks for the question and remind you guys who are listening, if you have questions, please reach out. It gives us some fun things to look into and talk about on the fitness side, or if you have questions on other areas that we focus on as well, please feel free to send those in. So again, thanks, Jaden.
Thanks all.